Welcome. I'm Sebastian Mahfood, and you're listening to WCAT Radio, the on-air wing of En Route Books and Media, bringing you the dulcet sounds of Catholic wisdom.
Well,
thank you, Teresa.
Have you here. Oh,
good to be back.
We're in show number 21.
Wow, moving right along.
We
yes.
are moving along. I think we talked a little bit about it might take us a little longer to finish than maybe we expected, and I'm all for that, if that's the case.
We're taking a leisurely walk through a local history.
I love
sure.
it.
Yeah,
I love it.
Me too.
And last time we started talking about the Osage Indians. It was fascinating, and we're going to continue there.
Yeah, that's right. These are the people that Faust refers to as the co-founders of St. Louis. In a lot of ways, that's very true. And we were also referencing another book, and that was Lewis F. Burns' The Osage History of the Osage People. Came out in 2004. I think last time around we left off with a little teaser because some of the Osage had gone to France.
Oh, that's right.
That's right, yeah. And this was in 1725, and they were brought there by the explorer Etienne de Bourgmont, and there was several Osage were brought. Now, there are two Osage groups, major groups. One's called the Little Osage, and then the other is the Big Osage. These are the Little Osage. So they're mainly up around the Missouri River.
Okay.
Up in that area there. But anyway.
So that was the group that's gone over to Paris.
That's the ones that go over to Paris, yeah.
Okay.
But basically they're the same peoples. What happens is that they meet with some French in Paris, including some philosophers, people of that nature. Shortly after that meeting, you have a book that's published by Charles de Montesquieu, and it's called The Spirit of Law. And Burns says that if you look at the way in which the Osage people live their public lives, their civic lives, and that book, there's a parallel. And that parallel is not found in 18th century France. So Montesquieu is not getting his ideas from France. And so one wonders whether or not he hadn't got the ideas from these quote-unquote noble savages, because that's all the rage in Europe at the time is these noble savages, return to nature, watch and see what the American Indians are doing, and that's how you reestablish happiness and that sort of thing. Rousseau, all those characters.
I am so impressed by that. I guess I had never heard that.
Yeah, and now it's speculation on Burns' part, but it makes a lot of sense.
It does make sense.
Yeah. So what he's talking about here is the principle of cooperation, certainly with others in times of peace and in times of war, to do the least harm necessary.
There's a good thing to remember.
The whole idea behind what he's speaking about, Montesquieu, in that spirit of law, is to establish a virtuous society, which is basically what the Osage had. Now, they had their teenage boys who were constantly, whooping it up and all, but institutionally it was. And this is what Burns says this. It's an interesting observation. He says, the institutions of these people may be called manners rather than laws. Among such nations, the old men who remember things past have great authority. They cannot, therefore, be distinguished by wealth, but by wisdom and valor. Wow, what a nice society they have there, huh?
I could see where we could use a lot of that today.
Yeah. And these are the people that Maxent, Leclerc, et compagnie want to have a commercial relationship with, and rightly so, rightly to understand that. So what's driving all of this is fashion, believe it or not.
Oh, my gosh.
Yeah. Even before Leclerc was born, it was really popular in Europe, if you could afford it, to have a beaver skin hat. That was all the rage, and that was because the trendsetter of the time was Louis XIV, and anything Louis did, well, that set the pattern for everybody else.
Okay.
They would follow as best possible. And so with that, you have really the growth of the fur industry in Canada, first of all.
Okay.
We find these trappers going out. And remember, some of the people we talked about very early on.
In the very beginning.
Yeah, Robert LaSalle,
right.
Louis Joliet, people of that nature had that's how they got introduced to going further and further west.
Yes.
And so they would go trapping. They would deal with the Native Americans. They would trap along with them. They would buy from them. There would be barter back and forth. And then they would come back to Montreal every year at one time where they had this thing called a rendezvous. It was always at Montreal. And trappers at a particular time of year, one particular time, they would all come. There's an example there of one time in Montreal, the rendezvous brought together 100,000 beaver furs, and they were replicating that year after year. The downside of that is because they were hunting so many, the beavers were being wiped out, and you had to go further and further and further west in order to keep up with that. And so deeper into Indian territory to trap and to trade. And the Indians are very interested in trading because there are things that the Europeans had that they wanted badly. And one of those is just iron tools.
Oh, sure.
Just an axe.
You can imagine
yeah.
how
Hose.
beneficial that's got to be.
Yeah. And then besides that, also firearms.
Oh, sure.
So that would be very helpful in the hunts also. And the other thing they really like too is what's called bottled suicide. And that would come in the form of brandy or rum.
Okay.
And the English were doing most of the rum, and the French were doing most of the brandy, and the Jesuits were telling both of them, stop, you're ruining people by doing that.
Uh-huh.
But, of course, they were being ignored. The British themselves, after 1763, remember, they win the French and Indian War. They now inherit all of this area. They're going to organize these trappers into companies. And in many cases, they're French Canadians, but now they're British subjects. And so they formed together one company called the Northwest Company, and that's centered in Montreal. Then there's another one called the Hudson Bay Company. It's going to be much further up north, and eventually it's going to find itself all the way out into the west, into Oregon and Washington State and northern, into Canada on the west side. That's going to take a good 60 years or so to get there, but that's where they're heading. There's another one called the Mackinac Company. And so the whole idea there is to exploit the upper Mississippi Valley and then Canada. And that's going to be a real competition then for the French, Laclede and his people a little bit further down. Now, typically, when you think in terms of St. Louis, and remember that St. Louis is founded looking west, not east. And so it's looking west. And typically what happened was in that relationship between Laclede and the Osage did the hunting, which they would do anyway. But then they would bring the furs to St. Louis sometime in May and in June. And then they would trade the furs for goods. And those traders, the Indian traders, would be hosted by the Spanish government.
Okay.
So when they arrived with all their stuff, but the Spanish made sure they had housing and food, bread and corn and all of that, and then they would do their bartering, and then when it was all over, then as the Osage were leaving, they would then receive gifts from the Spanish.
Okay.
And sometimes they were medals, just with maybe the picture of the king on it, or ribbons, or in some cases, a uniform coat. That was kind of a neat thing, or hats. As they were leaving the city, they would be given a bottle of something, alcohol after the visit. Again, the Osage were mostly interested in manufactured goods. They wanted pots. They wanted pans.
Sure.
Obviously, they can't make them themselves. They want knives, needles. Now, you think of something?
Oh, can you imagine
Yeah,
that? Yes.
yeah. Various kinds of tools. And then, of course, again, guns and shot and powder. That was very important for their hunting. To be an Osage warrior had to be the closest thing to heaven at that moment. I've been thinking about it. There are 28 tribes that were operating with the Laclede Company and doing business with him. And all they did was they went out 3 times a year and they went on these big hunts.
Where they already had these little houses set up where they could hunt and
That's it. And so for an outdoorsman, well, you can't ask for anything better than that.
And your wife did the gardening.
And the wife did the gardening, and also, and not only
raising the kids.
And raising the kids. And you go on and on. But then on top of that, she's also the one that processes the hide. So they're going to come back with all the game. They'll go ahead and rip out the hides, and then they hand them over to the Osage women were among the best hidesmen. I don't know what you call that, but,
Right.
but the processor,
Tanner?
a tanner. There you go, tanners, the best tanners in the world, and so they're doing great work with all the different animals, including deer, which becomes really important because over in Europe around this time, the idea of leather-bound books becomes really
sure.
popular. You know, if you go over to a library in Europe and you find a leather-bound book from the 1700s, there's a good chance that's a Missouri
A
deer.
Missouri hide.
Yeah, incredible.
Wow.
So here you have it. Interestingly, the Osage men kept the buffalo for themselves. When they hunted buffalo, they kept that for themselves, especially the food. A delicacy was the tongue. Buffalo tongue is evidently really good. I don't know. I don't care. But then also the buffalo skins were used for clothing, buffalo robes, especially in the wintertime. And then also they would be tanned out and used as lodge siding.
I was going to say, so were these then, so the buffalo were kept by the men, were they kept then out in those communities where they went out to do
No, they would carry
bring
the
it back
hides
in.
with them.
Okay.
So what you had was in those communities, those hunting communities that we were talking about, the third kind of community there,
Yeah.
what you had was the structure itself. So think of a framework of a cabin.
Right.
And when the Osage arrived to move in, then they'd go and they carried their siding with them. And,
That's right. I remember you saying that.
Really
It was just
incredible.
the posts were there, and then they.
Now, there is a historian of this era, fur trade, his name is Hiram M. Chittenden, and he's quoted in a book about all of this. It's a wonderful little book, by the way. It came out in 2004 by Shirley Christian. The title of her book is Before Lewis and Clark.
Oh.
And it's a history of the fur trade, and especially the Shoto family. But she includes in that a quote from Chittenden, and then her whole book disproves, in regards to the Osage, disproves his quote. So here's
Okay.
his quote. It's very clever, though. He says this. He says, "In the early intercourse of the white man with the Indian, each gave to the other something that they valued lightly, and received in return something that they valued highly." So think of this now. The Frenchman is giving lead
Okay.
to the Indian. He's giving an old pot to the Indian, and it's not worth much, But he's getting in return, he's getting all these pelts. Wow. From the Indian point of view, he's getting metal, he's getting lead, he's getting a pot. But he's just giving away these pelts. No big deal. What are you going to do with
Another
them
one
anyway?
down the street. Or
Yeah,
down the-
we'll go get more.
Right.
So Chittenden is right about this. He says, in the early intercourse of the white man with the Indian, each gave the other something that they valued lightly, and received in return something that they valued highly.
Okay.
And here's where he's wrong. And each felt a keen contempt for the stupid taste of the other.
Oh, okay.
Now that might be true in some cases. It is not true in the case of Laclede and Shoto. They changed all of that by going to the Osage and literally living with them.
Well, I say they respected them. They
Yes.
set them up and took care of them and fed them and housed them while they were there.
In St. Louis. Yeah. And so the rendezvous, in a sense, then is going to take place here in St. Louis. But it doesn't mean that Laclede sits in his little cabin there, in St. Louis. He and Shoto went out to central Missouri and lived in those communities, those Osage communities. Some of the Shotos in particular learned the Osage language.
Oh, wow. Great.
In fact, by the time that Auguste was 18, remember he founded St. Louis when he was 14, he's 18 years old. He's already living among the Osage, spending whole winters with them.
Wow.
In their main lodge.
Wow.
And the same thing is also true for his younger half-brother, Pierre, whose nickname is Cadet.
Okay.
Evidently, it's a French custom, or at least in that part of France, that the second boy, his nickname is always Cadet.
Okay.
So it's passed down from generation to generation. But yeah, they would go ahead and they would live with the Osage during the winter, and then come early summer, they would return back to St. Louis. So they're fluent. They know these people. They trust them. and the Osage trust them, and they trust the Osage. It's very important. It's going to be a lifelong relationship that the Spanish are going to make good use of, because the Spanish are not on good terms with the Osage. The two despise each other. And Choctaw is going to really keep them at peace. Later, when all that's sold to the United States, when the Americans come in, the very first thing they do is they go to the Choctaws and say, okay, let's work with us on this. Yeah, that's right. And they were more than happy to do that. So added to those two, you also have an extension of new business partners, and these are particularly the brothers-in-law. Okay. Remember that Madame Choctaw had mostly girls. She had one boy, and then the others were girls. And so they intermarry. And the first one to come on board is Sylvester Labadie.
Labadie. Okay.
Yeah, it was a little town outside of St. Louis, between St. Louis and Washington, called
Yes,
Labadie.
it is.
He marries Marie Pelagie Choctaw. They do a lot of business. And to give you an example of that, if you look at the licenses of 1777, it shows that the Choctaws reported over 10,000 pounds of deer skin. 10,000 pounds. The entire take for that year was 58,000 pounds. So more than 1 out of 6 went to the Choctaw family alone.
Wow.
And then everything else was divided up among everybody else. By this time, this is all coming specifically to the Choctaws and the Cleeds, because by this time, Maxant had gotten tired of the North. He never went up. He never came to St. Louis that I know of. And Laclede always had to go down to New Orleans to visit with him. In 1769, he totally lost interest, and he sold his interest over to Laclede.
Okay.
And this was to be done in 4 installments, annual installments, that would run to 80,000 livres. And it says something that Laclede was willing to pay 80,000 livres because the assets that were purchased only came up to 73,000. So it looks like Laclede immediately is taking a 7,000 livre hit, which is 10%, but he must have been expecting a pretty good return, and certainly the indications are that things are rolling along pretty well. But the reality is that debt plagued Laclede throughout his life. A couple reasons for that. One was he ran a very large accounts receivable.
Oh, okay.
He was very generous with people and gave them lots and lots of time to pay back, and many of them never did. And so that's not going to be helpful.
He didn't pressure him.
And he didn't pressure them. No, he was really good. The other thing was he was an incredible a book lover, and he bought books whenever he could. His library in St. Louis had 215 volumes.
Wow.
Now, back then, that's a lot.
That's a lot.
And looking over the volumes that he had, they were eclectic as can be. They were in French. They were in Spanish. Remember, he's fluent in Spanish also. Some of them were in Italian and some in English. I don't know how much Italian and English he knew, but he had the books anyway. He had made 2 trips down to New Orleans specifically to meet with Maxant, and each time he was there, he bought every book he could find.
Wow.
And then brought them back with him. So,
do we know, was he a big reader? Did he
evidently he was.
Okay.
Yeah, evidently he was. Yeah, a number of these early St. Louisans were. His collection of 250 books, that's pretty impressive for colonial St. Louis. When Bishop Dubourg arrives, he's got a library. I mean, it's a massive library. It's incredible. And then later on, people like Eliot will come in from New England, and he'll have a big library also. So St. Louis was not an illiterate city by any means. On December 31st of 1777, Laclede wrote to Auguste Choctaw, and basically in that letter, he included his will.
Oh.
He asked Choctaw to collect all of his debts, because obviously he wasn't very good at doing it himself, and then to pay everything that was owed. And he said this, and it's almost a premonition. Now, he's not that old, but he's writing on his way back up to St. Louis after this last visit in New Orleans. And he says, "If, by the will of God, I die on this voyage, will you have the goodwill and kindness to render me this service, So Laclede is 49 years old.
49.
49.
Okay.
But he's not feeling well.
Mm-hmm.
And so this is sort of a premonition. He ends the letter by saying this: "Goodbye, my dear sir. I desire to see you again and be able myself to settle my affairs, because it is very hard and painful, as I see, to have to die in debt. One bequeaths nothing but pain and trouble to friends when one dies poor. Such is my deplorable situation. One must suffer and not murmur."
That's so sad.
Yeah, it is.
For all the good he did.
Yeah.
How many, though, people...
And, if you balance off the accounts payable and accounts receivable, you probably did okay.
Right.
In fact,
right.
we're going to see the Shotos did very well. But nonetheless, that's his last sentiment that he has. And so he's making his way up the Mississippi River, which, of course, is always difficult.
Mm-hmm.
And he's hoping to get to the branch warehouse, which is located at Post O, Arkansas.
Okay.
Okay, it's the confluence of the Arkansas and the Mississippi River. He had a huge supply, an inventory there that was intended for St. Louis. He was going up to St. Louis. Interestingly enough, among the stuff that he was sending off to St. Louis included a 12-volume history of the Roman emperors.
Oh, my God.
For himself. So the guy never gives up.
He did still get those books.
He's on the original boat that he was on, that they built, that he when he came up to found St. Louis.
Yes.
The L'Espérance, the Hope. And he's also wearing with him that same little saber that he had gotten.
Yeah.
Remember, from
Yes.
Toulouse?
Uh-huh.
This is a guy with some real sentiment, you know. And so before he got to Post O's, Arkansas, he died on board.
Oh.
And so the captain of the boat came into the post and reported all of this to the Spanish commandant, who responded by quarantining the cargo, and then had Pierre Laclede buried on the banks of the Arkansas River. And it was, of course, very sad for everybody.
Mm-hmm.
Later, the bateau, the boat, would be released, as well as the goods, and sent up to St. Louis, which it arrived in St. Louis on July 19th of 1778, with, of course, Laclede not there.
Mm-hmm.
The captain went over to the lieutenant governor at the time. This was Fernando de la Bella. So the lieutenant governor and the captain then took the personal effects, the personal trunk, to Madame Choteau, and she had already received the news of the death. On August 1st, there was an inventory taken of the effects of Pierre Laclede by Lieutenant Governor Leyba and 3 citizens who were there to watch over this, one being Jean-Baptiste Sarpi and the other Auguste Choteau.
Uh-huh.
And later there would be an auction. And in the winter of 1778, Auguste Choteau, is now 28 years old, would settle the accounts.
Okay.
And with that, he would be able to give Maxent some 41,000 livres in cash and in hides.
Wow.
Basically, at that point, wiping out the debt. Yeah.
That 80,000.
Yeah, but actually, and this is something that's quite extraordinary, is that Laclede's debt to Maxent at that point was only 21,000 livres.
Oh,
and so he
doubled
actually
it.
doubled it. Yeah, incredible. The Choteaus were generous, and they could afford to be. Madame Choteau had enough money herself to buy the country estate and land that Pierre Laclede had. She, of course, already had received the in-town house,
right,
where her and the children lived. She bought that for 2,750 livres. Then Auguste turned around. He bought Laclede's mill for another 2,000 livres. So you're doing okay. And they sent a team down to Post O's, Arkansas, to exhume the body.
I was going to ask that.
Yeah.
Okay.
The river had shifted at that point, and they never found him. Yeah, Laclede is buried somewhere in the riverbed of the Arkansas River.
And that had been what? He died in either very late 77.
Yeah.
Or very early 78.
Yeah, it would have been. Yeah, it would have been early 78.
probably early 79.
Yeah,
They couldn't find
the body.
We're out of time for today, but
Okay.
another great show, Father. Thank you again. These
Hey.
are fantastic.
Yeah, great fun.
It is. It really is. So can we close with a prayer?
Sure. Glory be to the Father, to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit.
As it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be, world without end. Amen.
May Almighty God bless you in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit.
Amen. Thank you, Father.
We hope you enjoyed the program and will join us back for another show on WCAT Radio. This is Sebastian Mahfood. Good day.